This is Artful Discourse, your weekly escape into the vibrant world of creativity, culture, and intellectual exploration. I'm your host, Benjamin Kirk, and I invite you to join me on a journey through the rich tapestry of human thought and the beating heart of artistic expression at Fresno State's College of Arts and Humanities. There's a new podcast coming out of Fresno State's Institute for Media and Public Trust called Exploring Journalism's Future. The podcast examines the challenges and possibilities facing news organizations in the current media landscape. Founded by Jim Boren, Fresno State's Institute for Media and Public Trust works to find solutions to the fake news crisis and bridge the trust gap between news consumers and media outlets. Exploring Journalism Future podcast is in line with the Institute's stated goals by going beyond the talking points about the problems in journalism and actively seeks creative ways to resolve the trust gap and the myriad of other issues in the ever-changing media environment. So we have a full house in the studio today. Our guests are Jim Boren, Executive Director of the Institute for Media and Public Trust. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you for having me.
Betsy Hays, Professor in the Department of Media, Communications, and Journalism, or MCJ, and the podcast host.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
And I'm especially excited to see Lucca Lorenzi, alumnus and the 2023 College of Arts and Humanities Dean's Medalist, and now podcast editor. Welcome, Lucas. So good to see you again.
Thank you so much, Ben. Same here.
All right. Now, before we get into the podcast itself, I think it's important to talk about the Institute for Media and Public Trust. So, Jim, can you tell me in your own words what the Institute is and some of the current key initiatives and programs you're working on?
Well, thanks, Ben. Appreciate you having me here. When we started the Institute in 2018, it was about media trust and fake news, and those are still important. Misinformation is still on the forefront, but we've also now expanded that for journalism training programs for students and professional journalists. We have a Journalists of Color program to start a pipeline of students into the profession that's hosted by Fresno State's Institute, and we also are looking at issues that are important in the industry, especially the broken business model. So and that's one of the reasons we even decided to do this podcast is look at those challenges through the voices of thought leaders in journalism across the country.
Can you talk a little bit more about those issues?
Yeah. Sure, and the biggest issue is we have this broken business model where no longer the advertising that used to prop up most newsrooms is the forefront. Big tech actually has scooped that off, Google and Facebook and others. And now we're trying to look for ways in the industry to be able to fund a newsroom of journalists. News isn't free, and you have to pay reporters to gather information. So it's done through philanthropy now and some other initiatives, but philanthropy is usually the thing that they're looking at right now.
So we're kind of moving away from an advertising model or a pay-per-view model and more into a philanthropy model.
Exactly. Now, if there's nothing wrong with having the advertising model and the subscription model. In fact, one of our podcast guests, Eric Johnston, a Fresno State alum, is the CEO of Sonoma Media Investments, and that community up there, they have a 7-day-a-week news site. So we're exploring all those reasons. But even Eric will say that they're kind of an outlier. So for the most part, they need to find new revenue models.
Any other guests who are still working for-profit models?
Most of the others are one. Danielle Bergstrom has founded Fresno Land. We have Lauren Gustus at the CEO of the Salt Lake City Tribune, and they've gone to a nonprofit model. They used to be a profit-making newsroom. They've gone to a nonprofit model. We've talked to people like Priscilla Enriquez of the James B. McClatchy Foundation. They're on the other side. They're funding local newsrooms. In fact, they've created some here in the San Joaquin Valley.
So what was the impetus for creating the podcast? Where did the idea come about, and what are the goals for the series?
We really wanted to find a way to tell all these stories about journalism and the funding model through the voices of these thought leaders, and try to explore opportunities, um, through their ideas on how to do that. No, and maybe we could, crowdfund some ideas that somebody could listen to that podcast, take that. I mean, Daniel Bergstrom has kind of offered a manual on how to create your own local news site here in Fresno.
Now, the three of you here kind of work on this podcast. How does the kind of the day-to-day functions of putting this together work? Because right now you're releasing them weekly, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Betsy Hays I asked her to host the podcast because she has several other of her own podcasts. So
Mhm.
she's got a great history here. And then Lucca Lorenzi, we asked him to come on. He's been an employee of the Institute and a former student, and understands what we've been doing. So for the most part, Betsy and Lucca do all the heavy lifting. Um, the Betsy questions the guests, and Lucca does the technical part of it.
And is this something right now? There's 7 episodes as of the time of this recording. Is this intended to continue indefinitely? What does the future production schedule look like?
We we hope to have a second season. We may add one more to this season. We're having some scheduling issues, but when we have that, the first date was going to be that first um, season, and then after January, go into a second season
Mhm.
if it makes sense. And I think it does. We're getting really good listenership of the podcast, and I think people are using that. I mean, I'm seeing it on journalism websites that are referencing some of the things that people have said as talking points.
And I've seen it. It is on YouTube for everyone out there, and you can search for it. Just search "Exploring Journalism's Future," and it will pop right up. It's the first thing that comes up. Especially if you put in podcast after that, and not only YouTube, but YouTube Music. So if you have that app in your car, you can listen to it in your car as well. Is there anywhere else where people can find it?
Absolutely. It's available on Spotify through their podcasting platform, iHeartRadio, as well as Buzzsprout. And I believe we are working to get it up on some other platforms, but we're already really excited that it's out and about on so many different media platforms.
All right, thank you. Now, Betsy, you're hosting the podcast. Can you tell me about the guests you've had so far? How are the guests chosen? What and why are their perspectives important?
Yeah, it's been such a fabulous experience to get to spend, time with these folks and take a deep dive. And that really was sort of one of the missions of the podcast, is not for it to be a quick soundbite, for it to be, a 45-minute-ish conversation. So we really could get into the weeds on some of these business models, because the goal, and we talk about it on the podcast, our not so secret agenda is for, us collectively to figure out a way to enhance journalism, to grow in places where there are news deserts or news mirages, which is kind of when it's almost a desert. And so that was, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this longer form. The guests were chosen, collaboration between Jim and Luca and myself. We really wanted a diverse group of perspectives, coming from, the founders like Danny Bergstrom, to the funders, journalism funding partners and Priscilla Enriquez, and also the folks who have done these really unique things in really unique markets, like Lauren and the folks in Salt Lake, and then Eric up in Northern California. So when we're looking for things from all of these different angles, and we're starting to see these themes, then we know we've sort of hit something that we might want to investigate a little further.
Tell me more about the themes and the common threads you're finding through the guests.
Well, the revenue streams that we were just talking about are obviously the most important thing, right? You got to
Mhm.
pay the reporters, you got to keep the lights on, you got to keep the website domain hosted, and all that kind of stuff. And figuring out how to do that now, with the old model of, a combination of advertising and subscriptions, not being sufficient. And so what we're really seeing from our guests is the more revenue streams you have, the better. And the ones that are really, really successful are utilizing all of them. They're utilizing philanthropy. They're utilizing either subscriptions or memberships, depending on the model. They're utilizing advertising, and then they're also utilizing events. Some of them are getting quite a bit of revenue from having journalism related events, where, for example, they will invite the public to meet their journalists to talk about how they covered a certain really important local story. So they could really get the background and the context for that, or something that celebrates the community, events in that perspective. Awards programs, like Best of, XYZ City, those things have been, sponsored by the local news organization, have been revenue generating. The subscription and membership thing has been the most interesting, in my opinion. Several of the guests mentioned that most of their members slash and especially the membership model and the nonprofit model are not necessarily doing it to obtain the content. They're doing it to support the mission.
Mm.
And so that's a really cool thing. And hopefully that's something that, we can, continue to replicate and, get a little bit of groundswell support in that area. That's what the Fresno Land folks are doing, right?
Hmm.
So anyway, lots of really good themes.
With the added revenue streams, and this is a question for anyone on the panel here, but with the added revenue streams, you mentioned some of them are going to are keeping the subscription or maybe calling it a membership, and advertising and philanthropy. Is there issues that arise with kind of that wall that's traditionally there between the advertising executives and the newsroom? That there's usually kind of that
Mhm.
invisible wall that runs down the news building, so to speak.
Yeah, and that was my primary question as a consumer
Hmm.
when the philanthropic, separate from my role as a professor and as the host of the podcast, that was one of my thoughts when we first started exploring as a society this philanthropy model. And so that was definitely a question. And there's a lot of conversation about that on the different episodes. And the parallel that we sort of arrived at, which I love, is for centuries, journalism has dealt with having to have a wall between advertisers and the people who produce the news. And so the idea of keeping those two places separate, the revenue generating piece versus the content producing piece, is not a new idea. The only thing that's new is the wall is separating different people. So we still want to have a very specific line. You're absolutely correct, between the funders, the donors, the different organizations, the individuals, et cetera, and the people who produce the news. And to a person, everybody that we talk to, essentially have those conversations up front. There's policies on their website. Hey, if you want to be a donor, here's the deal. You do not interfere with our coverage. Journalism Funding Partners has conversations. They're like a matchmaking organization between news organizations that need a reporter in a certain area and funders who want to support that, like say environmental or something like that. Even before the match is made, everybody knows, hey, you're not getting to see the news stories before they're published. You are not getting to influence what is or is not covered. And these conversations up front make everything really clear. And it was really refreshing to hear that hasn't been an issue
Hmm.
at all with any of the folks that we interviewed.
Right.
Well, let me, it
Yeah.
made me jump
yeah.
in.
Please.
Um, I'm on the Journalism Funding Partners board, and Bessie explained it very well of the firewall that we have. In fact, it's written into the contract, so they would be violating their contract if they did that. But let's just take, for example, an environmental foundation.
Hmm.
They want more environmental news coverage, so they fund a reporter. That's as far as they go. They can say that we want this reporter to cover the environment, and then the newsroom, the editors, and reporters decide what stories. So environment is a big one. I think we've funded 15 environmental reporters in the south and the east part of the country. We've funded 2 First Amendment reporters, one in Florida, one in Tennessee, to just write about the First Amendment because the Freedom Forum wanted to fund that reporter, so that they've written about that. We've funded education labs where that reporter writes specifically education stories. No one tells them what stories. They use their journalistic background to decide what kinds of stories. But so there's environment, First Amendment, education, and almost every subject could be one. And many of these foundations are finding that it's a much better use of their money than open up an office and pay 3 people to listen to the same kind of story all the time, as opposed to funding a reporter who's going to write maybe 50, 60 news stories a year about the environment just in general.
Yeah. Now you mentioned there haven't been any issues so far, but are there concerns about losing funding because of stories that are critical to the organization who gave?
That's always an issue, much like you might use an advertiser, if they didn't like a particular story. But one that hasn't happened. What we are seeing, though, is foundations turn over and they have new leadership, and their priorities change, and they may want to put that funding into something else.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the the bigger challenges. But we haven't had anybody pull their funding specifically about the coverage.
Lucca, I want to talk to you a little bit about your role in the podcast. Tell me what
Yes.
you do.
Yeah, so I had the fortune of getting to edit each episode. Betsy would lead the discussion, and then I would take that recording and edit the audio and video, essentially package it for our platforms, and then also work with Betsy with regards to social media promotion, making sure it was getting out on our platforms and making people aware of it. So that was really, I felt like I got to do the extra fun part. And I felt really spoiled because every week I got an excuse to sit down and really listen to some interesting discussions. I'm not from a journalist background necessarily. I did study public relations, but my current profession is within marketing. So I think that these spaces are very squishy
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of the different industry terms and what you're dealing with, of course. But I think for me, it was an extra learning opportunity. And I just have a deep interest and passion for understanding and trying to contribute to the future of our nation's journalism industry. I do believe there are a lot of solutions out there. And I think that's the exciting part is seeing what are people doing to solve this opportunity as we'll see it.
How has your experience as a former MCJ student, your time at Fresno State, how has that informed what you're doing now on the podcast? Has it helped? Has it added? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely, in so many various ways. For one, directly different courses that I took, the curriculum that was a part of those courses have enabled me to be able to edit this podcast. Although I'm not a videographer or I'm not an expert in editing audio, I took courses at Fresno State that taught me how to work in Adobe Premiere Pro, which is the software that we use for editing this podcast. And also just general, you know, strategies when it comes to advertising this podcast. Because it's one thing to make it, but then how do you make people aware of it? Because you can't just push publish and it's going to advertise itself. There's so many more steps beyond that. But additionally, it's been so neat to see 2 of my professors, Betsy and Jim, who have taught me and seeing them in that element, getting to see them in their professional element, just really asking such fascinating questions and holding really interesting conversations. In that way, I feel like I'm getting an extra course just by learning by watching and
Mm-hmm.
listening.
Well, in doing.
Yes, yes, indeed.
And so talk to me a little bit more. about the public relations side, because you said it's not just pushing a button to publish. It is actively promoting it. What are some of your efforts been to actively promote the podcast? And maybe if you can tie that back to your training at Fresno State as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This has kind of been an ongoing discussion, but our big push has been across digital media platforms, looking at social media kind of being our engine to drive the discussion and engagement. But we also want to see if we can hopefully expand, the life of this season one,
Mhm.
because even though it's wrapped up now, or almost wrapped up, we believe, there's some opportunity to maybe celebrate the conclusion, maybe have an in-person gathering. So there's beyond just digital. I think our minds often today go to, the digital side of things, which is extremely important. But you also want to think of, good old traditional getting people together and celebrating a big achievement that I think we have all worked really hard on. And just reminding ourselves of like, we have achieved this and these episodes are out there. Let's share it with our respective communities. That's something that we're certainly have been grateful for our guests as well. I know that they've shared it out on their platforms, which has been really wonderful and helpful, and an extra leg of advertising, if you will.
And just as far as the production value of the podcast, I do want to say you're doing an excellent job. It looks great. It sounds great. So you are doing a
Oh,
fantastic
thank you,
job with
Ben.
all of that. All right. So I kind of want to open a couple questions for everybody here. So, um, what impact do you hope the podcast will have on journalism industry and the community as a whole?
Take that first.
Yeah. Well, just putting that conversation out there as a conversation starter, one of the things to piggyback a little bit on what Luke was saying is that one thing we're considering is going into the transcripts of these thought leaders and see what the themes are. Maybe write stories and maybe write bullet pieces. Maybe we pull out of those 45 minutes, 2 minutes of soundbite and push those out. Looking for ways to keep that conversation going about the future of journalism, and we chose exploring the future of journalism very specifically because that's what we want to do. We want to have people think about this and come up with their own kinds of things, their own ideas to push the future of journalism, find better funding models.
Mhm.
Um, try to find out why people, don't pay for the news content that they consume. Very few people will pay for that. Back in my early days, we had 200,000 people that would buy an annual subscription to the Fresno Bee. Now you might just have a small number uh, in a community. One thing, the internet has taught people that they can get everything for free, so they don't want to pay for it now. So how do we, give them good content? As we said earlier um, in this session, is that you cannot gather news for free. You have to be able to pay 8, 10, 15 reporters to go to school board meetings, go to city council meetings, investigate certain kinds of things. And it takes money to do that. None of these sites are, making these folks millionaires. They're
Right.
barely keeping the doors open in some instances. So we want to keep that conversation going.
The other thing too is we wanted to, provide a little bit of hope in a realistic way. So much conversation about journalism and news is very dreary. There's a little bit of a gloom and doom sort of component to that, and while we are definitely this podcast is not Pollyanna. It is not sunshine and roses, but it also I think provides a platform for light at the end of the tunnel, for hope that we're going to be able to do some good things, and to have a little bit more of a positive lens
Mhm.
on this particular industry that is going through a huge transition. And just because something is going through a huge transition doesn't mean it's going to end in its demise. There's a lot of options between X and Y, right? And so that's why we wanted to do this as well.
And that kind of leads me into my next question a little bit, because what is the future of journalism? What does it look like? Is the future bright?
Well, there's always going to be the need for storytellers. to tell that story, whether it's, again, at the school board level or at the national level. So somebody's going to be telling that story. So you're always going to have journalism. Maybe the platforms will change. Likely they will. We talk so much about the technology today. In 10 years, that technology, we won't even be using it, just like we weren't, 20 years ago. And we have to also remember that the internet, which sort of, changed all our thinking on this, is relatively young. 20, 50 years down the road, things are going to change. But there's always a need for a storyteller. I mean, the most basic thing that a child asks their parents, tell me a story. And journalists are always going to be telling stories.
I might add on that. I think what's so interesting is you think about like the printing press and how that made information so much more widely accessible. Now you have the advent of the internet and how much more that made information widely accessible. And again, as we were saying earlier, it kind of trained us, or at least my generation, to think, oh, this information is free to me. Why would I pay that? So looking at the future of journalism as someone who kind of grew up alongside the advent of the internet, I think it is, looking to interact with younger generations, reach them where they are, and maybe asking them to maybe take some steps in that sense of reaching out to information sources, credible information sources. And I think it's going to be a constant evolving game. But I think, again, it goes back to how I said earlier, I think it's an opportunity for all of us to really see, journalism certainly isn't stagnant. So the business model can't be stagnant. We know that to be true now. And so I think there's an exciting answer that lies in that.
All right. Is there anything I missed? Anything anyone would like to add?
I just think that this conversation really needs to continue. And I think it needs to continue not just with journalists and not just with people who run news organizations. As consumers of news, this should be really important to us as well. Being able to have a source of, accurate, factual information is essential for us being able to, live our lives. And so we all need to be part of this conversation. We need to be able to have these sources that we can trust. And so it's important.
And I also think that if we can inspire meaningful conversations, as Betsy said, through the entire community about the future of journalism, get people engaged on the importance of it, I think we'll have done what we intended to do.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim, Betsy, and Lucca. It was a pleasure to have you here today. You can find Exploring Journalism's Future podcasts on YouTube and YouTube Music, and by searching the title, and many other platforms. So just search Exploring Journalism's Future and put it on your podcast playlist. It's great listening. Artful Discourse is a production of the College of Arts and Humanities at California State University, Fresno. The dean is Dr. Honora Chapman. This program is written, directed, and produced by me, Benjamin Kirk, the college's communication specialist. The theme song for Artful Discourse is Maiden Voyage by Fresno State music professor Benjamin Boone from his album, Joy. More information about his music can be found at benjaminboone.com. Special thanks to KFSR and FSR Underground General Manager Julie Lindahl for making this show possible. You can learn more about the College of Arts and Humanities and find an archive of our shows at our website, cah.fresnostate.edu, or on our blog, fresnostatecah.com.